Okay, here's a story I think you guys are going to absolutely love. You're going to love it. It's a real story. There's a whole story around this Bigfoot thing going on here, and it's really good. It's really good. So you guys settle down and listen up because you're going to enjoy this. The writer's name is Steve, and here's what he writes. Back in 1980, I worked second shift at one of those factories where they work you like a dog, treat you like dirt, and they pay you very little for it. We had two bosses. One was a drunk and the other was a jerk. I hadn't worked there long when they hired Gary. We were about the same age and we both had a wife and child to care for. Many nights after work, we'd sit out in the parking lot and talk about our wives and complain about work. And when Gary talked about his wife, his eyes lit up and a smile came over his face. I never met his wife, but she must have been really something special. Most Friday nights into Saturday mornings, someone would bring a cooler of beer. When you get off work at 2 a.m, you just can't go straight home and go right to sleep. Most of the time, you'd have to unwind when you got home, so kicking back in the parking lot for a while helped. On one of those nights, Gary said he needed some help putting brakes on his truck. I said, yeah, come on over Saturday afternoon, be there about 2. That way, if we need something in town, we'll have time to go get it. Saturday rolled around and Gary showed up at my house. And I took one look at him and I knew immediately that something was wrong. I didn't push the issue, but I did let him know that if there was anything I could do for him, all he had to do was let me know. And then I made sure he wasn't angry with me. I didn't want to be working under his truck if he was pissed off at me. An hour and a half later, with the brakes installed and the truck ready to go, I asked Gary if he wanted a beer. We went out to the backyard and we chugged down a few. After a while, he told me that his wife was leaving him. He was heartbroken. I really didn't know what to say, but I kept talking and stalling him as long as I could. I didn't want him to leave and drive drunk and then wind up in jail. He was a cheap drunk, 3 beers in, and he was seeing 2 of me. Damn, that sounds like me. I decided what better way to distract him than to do a little target practice. It probably wasn't the best idea, but it worked. I got my .22 and I set up some targets. And a couple hours later, he seemed to be okay. And that's when he went out to his truck and he pulled out a pistol. I don't remember if it was a .38 or a .357. He unlocked the toolbox on the back and got out a box of shells and we shot half the box. We were real crack shots. If we hit a target, it was by accident. Another hour went by and he said he wanted to get on home. He was still upset, but in a lot better shape than he had been, so I figured he'd be okay. As he drove away, I said a little prayer for him, that he and his wife would somehow work things out. And I was cleaning up and I happened to notice that Gary had left that half a box of shells on the table. So I put them in the plastic bag and stuck them in my truck so I could give them back to him on Monday. And when Monday came around, there was no Gary at work. And at lunchtime, I called him, but he didn't answer. Well, I was worried, so I drove over to his house after work. His truck was there, but it was so late at night, I decided not to stop. On Tuesday, Gary showed up for work, and it was apparent that things hadn't gotten any better. If it wasn't work-related, he didn't speak. After work, we went out to the parking lot, and once everybody else left, he opened up and he started talking. When Gary had gotten home Saturday, the whole house was empty. His wife was gone. He said he went after her, but he realized there was nothing he could do. He was full of rage and hatred and just started driving around. Pretty soon he found himself out on some old logging road. He didn't really know where, he just kept driving. And then it started raining and the road got slick. Well, he was driving too fast and he wound up in a ditch. There was no way that he was going to get himself out of there without any help. He was looking around and he noticed a pond down by an embankment. He grabbed his pistol and he walked down and he sat on a stump by the water. Then he started crying. He decided to end his life right there. He let out a loud, agonizing scream, and he put the pistol in his mouth and he pulled the trigger. Click. He realized he'd left the shells in the truck. So he went back up, opened the toolbox, and grabbed the box of shells. And then he went back down to the pond and sat back down on the stump and raised the pistol up to his mouth. Just then, a rock about the size of a basketball splashed into the water and it soaked him. He turned around, but no one was there. There was no sound at all, just an eerie silence. Suddenly, something ripped through the silence with a scream as loud as a freight train. That was followed by rumbling in the bush, and at this point, Gary was halfway back to the truck, and he could hear something closing in on him. In a panic, he jumped into the truck that was now sitting back on the road and facing the direction from whence he came. He got a glimpse of the creature before he tore off down the road. He said it was a Bigfoot. I walked over to my truck and I pulled out the plastic bag with a half a box of shells in it, the ones he'd left at my house, and I handed them to him. The look on his face was priceless. He went over and got the box of shells that he'd had at the pond. The boxes looked the same, but the shells he had were for a .45. No way they would fit in a .38 or a .357. Gary looked up at me and he said, "Bigfoot saved my life." "Perhaps," I said, "or maybe he just didn't want you messing up his watering hole." Gary said he'd never been so scared in his life. He couldn't understand why the thing let him go. It could have had him any time it wanted. He told me how he'd gone some 10 miles before it sank in that his truck had been pulled out of the ditch and was facing back the way he had come. Well, I took a look at his truck. It did have mud on it. There were smears of mud on the bumper, but no real damage. Thinking back, I realized that those mud smears were right where you'd hook the chains if you were pulling it out of a ditch. Maybe not chains, but maybe some massive hands. Gary wasn't the kind of guy to make up stories. I never remember us ever talking about Bigfoot or ghosts or anything like that. Back then, Bigfoot was not a big deal. We never really took that stuff seriously. But now, Gary is a believer, and I'm a bit more open-minded. 2 weeks before Christmas, there was a big layoff, and we both lost our jobs. I lost contact with Gary, but I heard his wife went through with a divorce, and he moved back to Tennessee. Wherever he is, I wish him well. And that's the end of his story. Man, what a great story. I mean, it's horrible that this guy lost his wife, and then he was so distraught over it that he was wanting to commit suicide, take his own life. But apparently, a Bigfoot saved his life. Now, did the Bigfoot know what he was trying to do? Or was that scream that he did before he pulled the trigger the first time? You know, that kind of moan of grief and anguish? I wonder if that's what drew the Bigfoot in. But if the Bigfoot intervened and for whatever reason, he did save Gary's life, I think this is one of the coolest stories I have gotten since I started this channel. The man, Steve, who wrote the email to me, what a good friend he is to Gary. It would be great if those guys could reconnect and kind of reminisce and talk about things. Gary, I'd like to have friends like you. I guarantee you, man, I'd love to have friends like you. Kind of look out for your buddies and make sure they're okay. And what a great testament to a good friend. Okay, I'm just rambling, but those are the thoughts I had on my mind, so I thought I'd share them with you. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Dixie Cryptid podcast. My name is Cam Buckner, and all we do here is tell stories. And we did one documentary. Anyway, we're back to doing real stories by real people in this podcast, and that's the plan for the foreseeable future. Don't have any plans for anything else. If I do anything different, it'll go on the What If It's True podcast. You can find that. I'll link it below in the description. If you guys would like to hear other stories that we've done that aren't Bigfoot related, you can go to the What If It's True podcast on YouTube or on the podcast network. I'll also upload these Dixie videos, the audio to that podcast, so that people who don't like the ads, who prefer to use the podcast format, upload them all there. All you have to do is whatever podcast app you use, just search for What If It's True podcast. It'll be right at the top of the list because it's actually a pretty popular podcast, as we've gotten almost 1 million downloads since I started it a little over a year ago, and I'm just having fun with it. So, all right, let's get into this video. I got 3 really good stories. Hope you guys enjoy them. All right, here we go. All right, here's an email from Casey from Oklahoma, and this is pretty good. I lived in rural Oklahoma now for about 13 years, and I've loved every minute of it. It's beautiful country. From 2012 to 2015, I lived in an area with long creeks and high cliffs where I assume there must have been a lot of caves. The first day that my father and I moved into our house, we were greeted by Ferdinand. He was a gorgeous big black hound dog who had been living there by himself for a year. Since he seemed so healthy and well-fed, we asked the neighbors if they'd been feeding him and taking care of him, but they said they hadn't. So we figured Ferdinand must be a good hunter and was staying fit on a diet of rabbits and other small game. We went about doing our renovating, and we eventually moved into the house, and Ferdinand hung out and kept watch over our activities. 2 days after we finally got moved in, my son got up to go to work and discovered the front half of a baby deer that looked to be no more than 2 weeks old lying in the driveway. Now, we're country people, and we understand the animals in the area and how the different predators act. So we went through the various scenarios trying to figure out what predator would have done this to this fawn. It couldn't have been a big cat because they usually eat part of their prey and take it somewhere, often up a tree. They go for the back of the neck and they leave claw marks. Plus, there would have been a gut trail. But there were no claw marks and no gut trail. There were no bite marks, no paw prints, and no drag marks. This deer looked like it had been ripped in half, disemboweled, and thrown into our yard 40 or 50 feet from the road. It was 5 a.m. when my son discovered the fawn, and he came straight back inside and told me about it, and we went out to inspect it. My dogs came with me, but they wanted nothing to do with the carcass. They wouldn't touch it or even go near it. And it was creepy the way they were acting. What was even more disconcerting was how Ferdinand walked right over to it and dragged it up under a tree, and he started eating it. Later, I found other bones buried in the pine needles under the tree, and apparently something had been feeding Ferdinand all along. 2 weeks after we found the fawn, my neighbor and dear friend who lived up the road from us found another half of the baby deer in a ditch about 1.5 miles from our house. I guess it was just a coincidence. Within a couple of weeks of us living there, my dogs began to acclimate to Ferdinand's lifestyle. Each morning, I'd let them out when Ferdinand started whining for them. When they'd go outside, their hair would stand up on their backs and they would start barking and acting nervous. After a few minutes, they'd change their demeanor completely. They'd wag their tails and they'd take off on a run. I wouldn't see them again until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. They always came home smelling like they'd been in a lion's den, but with an underlying metallic odor. This went on for the duration of the 2.5 years we lived there. When my father and I moved into that house in June of 2012, it had been sitting empty for a year. Immediately after we moved in, we began to notice little things. For example, things would be moved in the yard. They were random things, but they were large. There were some old farming implements that had been sitting out there that we'd been cleaning around. And I came around one morning and found them stacked oddly, just stacked. We had glass sliding doors in one bedroom off the living room. The doors were visible from the living room, and we often saw very large, very tall silhouettes cross those doors at night. My dog's hackles would always go up, and they'd growl a little before quickly settling down and going back to acting normal. I really do think my dogs were friends with these beings. One night I was on my back porch with my father. The dryer wasn't working, so I was hanging out laundry on a temporary line stretched across a semi-wraparound porch. We'd been out there for about an hour, just talking and visiting in our normal voices, when my dad excused himself to go inside. Only seconds after he left, something knocked with a huge object against one of the dead trees in our backyard. It was an old dead elm tree that stood 30 feet from the house and was probably 60 feet tall. It sounded like it was being hit by another large log. There were 3 knocks, followed by a call that sounded like something between a man, a bear, and a wolf. I can't explain it. That was immediately answered by 3 more knocks from the other side of the yard and another call that sounded like a female or maybe a younger version of the first call. There's a huge raspberry patch that stretches along the outside of my yard's fence. The patch is several feet wide and at least 90 feet long. These trees were right up in the middle of this patch. The hair was standing up on the back of my neck like never before. It wouldn't be the last time. About a month after that incident, a friend and I were out rabbit hunting on some land we'd been given access to a quarter-mile north of my house. We were also scouting the area for signs of deer for later that year. He was on a four-wheeler and I was on foot. We were communicating via walkie-talkie. Through my binoculars, I watched as he made his way across the field in front of us. He crossed a creek and headed up onto the ridge. Just before 6 that evening, as the sun was beginning to touch the horizon, we heard knocking. It started behind him on the left side of the hill. It was answered by a second knock from the right side, a little further down and a little closer to him. He kicked the four-wheeler into gear and started down the hillside, still scouring the ground for deer tracks. And then a second wave of knocking came. He abandoned his search for deer tracks and concentrated on moving down off that ridge. It continued for 15 minutes as he worked his way down the hillside and across the creek and back through the field toward me. Every time he stopped, the knocking would resume on both sides of him. It kept up until we reached the gate that opened onto the road. We didn't stick around. We were obviously in their territory and they didn't want us there. My friend eventually went back there to hunt with his dad a couple of times, but they didn't have any luck. There was no game in the area. Oh, Casey, that's an awesome story. What's interesting to me most is your dog, your Ferdinand, the dog that had just hung around. You know, domestic dogs, they'll learn to feed themselves somehow or another, or they'll starve to death, one or the other. And apparently this dog either learned to hunt, like you said, rabbits and squirrels and other small rodents, or something was feeding this thing. That's really interesting to me. And then the last thing in the story, there was no game in the area. You know, I put out that documentary about a month ago called Bigfoot Hunters Film, I think is what I called it. Pretty good film if you guys haven't seen it, if you guys are interested in that kind of thing. It's about an hour and a half long, and I really worked hard on it. But anyway, we were talking, I was talking with those guys that I was with on that trip, and one thing that I noticed while I was there that I've never talked about, but the whole time we were in those mountains, bushwhacking back in there and hammock camping, I never saw any wildlife, not a bird, not a squirrel. Y'all excuse me, my throat is still messed up. I'm trying to talk here. I never saw a squirrel, a bird, a hawk, nothing. Not one sound, Not one bit of wildlife. I didn't even see a bug. Now, it was wintertime and the bugs are, I guess they're all dead or under the ground or under a rock or something, but I didn't see a fish in the water. There was absolutely no wildlife. And it's one of the few times I've ever been off in the woods. You know, if you get off in the woods and you're real quiet, you just sit down and just kind of watch. Usually the activity comes back really quick. Within 5 or 10 minutes, the squirrels start chirping and you can see them moving around in the trees and the birds flit around and you can hear them. But the whole time we were there, we never saw, any evidence of wildlife. I thought that was so weird. We did smell a skunk, or we thought it was a skunk. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was a Bigfoot, but it was a real strong smelling skunk. And that's the only evidence of wildlife that I was aware of the whole time we were in those mountains for that 3-day weekend. So I don't know. That really doesn't mean anything. I just thought I would mention it. It kind of just popped in my head. So I thought I'd tell you about it. Okay, Casey, thanks for this story. It was really great. Let's move to another one. All right, this last story is kind of short, but it's really good. The writer's name is Robin. Here's what he writes. In an older video, you talked about people handing down stories from older generations. Well, here's one my father's cousin told me. My name is Robin, and I was 12 years old when Durwood shared this story with me. Durwood was my father's cousin. He and his wife, Deanie, and their 2 daughters used to visit us on the weekends. They would bring boxes of donuts or burgers, and they would visit for a few hours. I liked it because we got to stay up past our bedtime. Our parents didn't mind, and I always looked forward to their visits. They are all gone now, including my parents, and I decided to share this story with you and the rest of our friends and not let it die. Now, y'all know what he means by the rest of our friends. He's talking about you. This is such a cool community. I consider all of you guys my friends, and I know I'm interrupting the story here, but I was just thinking the other day, you guys leave the nicest comments. You know, when I was sick, I'm not sick, but I'm got a scratchy throat. You can probably hear it, but do you realize how many emails and private messages I got on Facebook wanting to know if I was okay? I have a lot of friends out there, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. So anyway, back to the story. So he writes, so I decided to share this story with you and the rest of our friends, meaning you, and not let it die. In the late 1960s, Durwood and his family bought a farm in Calhoun, Kentucky, which is 20 miles south of Owensboro. They were so excited to be living on a farm of their own. Durwood was a truck driver who worked second shift. He felt good knowing, while working at night, that his family was safe in the country away from the dangers of city life in Louisville. That's where we lived, and I must admit I was a little jealous. I would have loved the farm life. But that was until Durwood and Deanie shared their experiences. It was approaching night on their 3rd day on the farm. Deanie and the girls were still unboxing treasures and settling in their new life. A window over the sink looked out into the backyard. There was a 4-foot split-rail fence that separated the backyard from a large cornfield. Deanie had finished unpacking a box when she decided to heat up a frozen pizza for dinner. Durwood would be home soon. As she glanced out the top kitchen window, she was met with a pair of glowing red eyes. She screamed and motioned for the girls to head to their bedroom quickly. The girls were both scared out of their wits, and they begged for explanation. Deanie told them to draw the drapes and to sit quietly. Well, it wasn't long before they heard Durwood pull into the driveway, and he came in the house. Deanie ran to him and told him what she saw in the window. So Durwood ran for a shotgun and headed out the back door. He was a tall, lanky fella, and he was fearless and brave. He immediately saw the creature, and it ran away on its hind legs, and it jumped the fence with little effort. He shot at the wolf-like creature when it crested the fence, and it let out an ungodly scream before disappearing into the cornfield. He had hit it. "Damnedest thing I ever saw," said Durwood when he told me the story. The next morning, he found the blood trail, and he began tracking the creature through the cornfield until the field ended at the dark woods. He wanted to go in after this thing, if for nothing else, to see what it was. Maybe it had died in the night, but maybe it hadn't. So he elected to leave it be, and he went back to the house. Later that day, everything they had moved into their new home was loaded back into a moving truck, and they headed back to Louisville. Apparently, the city wasn't that bad after all. And that's the end of the email. Robin, that's a great story, man. Oh, I loved it. I loved it. It was, I always say I love these stories, but I mean, this family was terrified. But I don't think it bothered Durwood too good. I bet Durwood would have stayed. What do y'all think? Durwood was a pretty tough guy. I think Deanie and the two girls were ready to get back home to Louisville. That's what I think. But what a cool story. It's like a dog man or a werewolf down in Owensboro, Kentucky, or up in Owensboro, Kentucky from where I live. I don't know why, but I always thought, and I've spent a lot of time in Owensboro and Evansville and Louisville and that area. It used to be one of my sales districts, and I used to travel that area quite a bit. Bowling Green and Lexington and Elizabethtown and all over Kentucky. But Owensboro is a nice place. They claim they're the barbecue capital of the world, but I don't want to get anybody upset. I just won't say it. But I'm from Memphis, so I mean, that's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say. But anyway, Owensboro is a great town, and I lived in Kentucky for 10 years, and it's a great state, beautiful state, clean state. I lived in Lexington. Man, what a clean, nice city that is. Okay, I'll stop talking. I'm so glad that you guys joined me on this video, and thank you for all the comments and the well wishes and the emails and the Facebook messages and all the nice things you all do for me. I just can't believe I've made such good friends while doing this. And hey, by the way, we're going back to Gatlinburg this year in July. I think it's July 23rd. Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference. I don't know. Y'all can look it up on the internet. It should be easy to find, but I think it's on the 23rd of July. Nance with Buckeye Bigfoot and I have booths right next to each other. Can't wait to see her and her husband Dean, and April and I are going to be there. We're trying to figure out what to do with our dogs, but we'll figure it out. Boarding dogs is not a big deal, but I have an old dog who's a diabetic. She has to get 2 insulin shots a day, and so I got to be real picky with who I leave her with, because she's my baby. She's my baby, and I take care of that girl best I can. And I want to make sure she's left with someone that'll love her as much as I do. All right, good grief. Motormouth. Anybody ready for me to shut up? How about I shut up? You guys have a good week. We'll see you in a couple, 3 days with another podcast. Love you all. See you on the next one. Thanks.